Next lecture onwards, we will be dealing with full-scale case studies. So what is the statutory merger? The statutory merger is one of the most common forms. I'm pretty sure all of you must have seen some versions of it. So essentially, it consists of the acquirer and the buyer. And in the end, you end up with either a new firm, which is either simply the original acquirer, or in some cases the buyer, or in some other cases even the buyer's subsidiary. So the old firms legally stop existing, and you end up with a new firm, which can be either one of these three. Nonetheless, mergers are more or less friendly, except with the one exception that we will be considering later. More or less mergers tend to be quite friendly in nature, wherein they require both the approval of both the acquirer and the buyer's boards of director, and approval by simple majority of outstanding shareholders. So outstanding shares over here, because shareholders do not equal share. It's not as though one vote is necessarily equal to one person, but rather one vote is equal to one share, unless specified in the firm's bylaws. And can anybody tell me over here what a bylaw is? No? So a bylaw is essentially a firm's own set of corporate laws. There are many corporate laws which directly arise from, say, the legal system of the country. But within those laws, a company can also write its own laws, which are referred to as bylaws. And when all three of these groups, that is basically the acquirer, the buyer's boards of director, as well as the outstanding shareholders approve, then afterwards the regulatory body should also approve. So as an example, in the US, in most cases, this is the secretary of the state for the local state. So upon all of this happening, essentially a merger is complete. And this regulatory dimension is very important. Now, a merger can be with cash, wherein you exchange the shares of the original buyer firm for cash, and then you end up with something called cash out. Cash out because you're giving up your stake in the company, a stock for stock swap, or you can even pay them with bonds. But nonetheless, this is one of the most basic forms of, takeovers that we typically have seen so far. Now, the more interesting dimension comes from tender offers. Why? Because tender offers do not necessarily have to be friendly. In many cases, they can also be hostile. In other words, the company which is being taken over does not necessarily have to approve or agree with the tender offer itself. And as a result of that, there's also the case that tender offers can become quite ugly. And in a very important sense, this is precisely the point where we have to step in and we have to value many of these firms to understand how much we should be offering the shareholders of these firms. So what a tender offer consists of is purchasing the shares directly from the target shareholders. So as an example, if you happen to be, say, an acquirer, say you happen to be Apple, and you want to take over Microsoft, instead of directly going to the Microsoft's board, or instead of, asking the board for approval, what you do is you go to the Microsoft shareholders and you ask them to sell their shares to you. Now, that can both be friendly, wherein the Microsoft's board approves, or it can be hostile, where the Microsoft board disapproves. But the main question over here is, why do target shareholders sell? So if as an example, if I just give you a toy example over here, wherein I have a company like Apple, which is taking over Microsoft, then, well, Apple can obviously try to buy, but then why would the Microsoft shareholders sell to Apple?
Because the price is better than the price on the market.
That's exactly right. So what we learned from the past lecture was typically that firms overpay. That is, the acquirers, that is in this case, the Apple, tends to overpay. And also, even if they are not overpaying, what they do is that they are paying the amount which is equal to the fundamental value plus the value of synergy or value of control. So this value by itself is greater than the fundamental value, which is why the shareholders of Microsoft are willing to sell to Apple. Also, one more reason is because of the fact that in many cases, in many cases, the firms like Microsoft, in this case, this is just a toy example, but the companies which are typically taken over are poorly run. So there is a lot of value just by transferring the control. So even if there was absolutely no synergy, just by handing over the control, you would end up getting a lot of value. Now, the way a tender offer would work is that Apple would go to Microsoft shareholders, and then it would try to get at least 50% of the outstanding shares. That is, it would try to get control of that given firm. Now, what happens to, let's just say this is 50.1. Now, what happens to the remaining 49.9? Those are also shareholders of the firm. And by the way, these are the outstanding shares, not the voters. So it could very well be that those 49.9 are larger number of voters, larger number of shareholders than the people who sold the 50.1. So in other words, one person is not equal to one share. In many cases, there are large block holders who own large numbers of shares in these companies. So what happens in this case is that Microsoft, the 49.9%, they might deliberately try to keep Apple dealing Apple's, merger with Microsoft quite simply because of the fact that they want a better deal. And under most legal systems, the minority shareholders cannot simply hold a merger process hostage in order to get a better deal. So as a result of that, what happens is something called squeezing out, where the minority shareholders get kind of pushed out of the whole system. And the majority shareholder, in this case, Apple, is able to dictate the terms, and the minority shareholders simply have to accept them. So as an example, if Microsoft was giving something like $100 and these minority shareholders wanted something like 102, they would still have to accept those 100 because they have lost the majority. And the reason why this is not expected that these individuals, the 49.9%, have to give some sort of consent is because of the fact that already the other 50.1 have given their consent. The majority has given their consent by selling the shares. So it's more like an implicit consent to this takeover. So if you guys have any question at any point, feel free to stop me because today I have a lot of things to cover. So I won't be constantly stopping and asking you to whether you have some queries or otherwise. So now there are two types of tender offers. The first one is friendly. Now, as an example, going back to the toy model that we looked at earlier, suppose Apple goes to Microsoft. And the board of Microsoft says to Apple that we approve of this takeover, this tender offer. You can approach our shareholders and you can buy their stock so that you get a majority. That would be a friendly takeover. So that is a friendly tender offer. And what happens in this case is that both Apple and Microsoft's management teams sit together and then they decide upon different types of dimensions. So as an example, one thing that they often talk about is who is going to remain within management. Also, they talk about, in this case, because it's Microsoft, they also talk about, say, their intellectual property, how it's going to be shared, and other forms of short-term and long-term strategies. So essentially, in this friendly takeover, there's this discussion period that happens. Now, Apple holds the upper hand over here because it has approached Microsoft. And it is going to approach Microsoft shareholders and try to get the 50.1%. So because Apple already has such a high degree of leverage, what Microsoft does is, in order to have these discussions in good faith, it puts something into place called a standstill agreement, wherein it says that the acquirer, the Apple, cannot go and start, buying more and more stock. It cannot resort to aggressive tactics to basically bully Microsoft's management into making compromises on these different strategies. Now, that standstill agreement goes on typically when as the negotiation is going on, and this friendly tender offer works that way. Now, obviously, one major disadvantage of this is that the acquirer abandons the element of surprise. And in case, for instance, there's a leak, the acquirer, that is Apple in this case, will have to pay higher cost. Now, why will it have to pay higher cost? So suppose it abandons the element of surprise. What's the worst that could happen?
Uh, Maybe other new shareholders can drive the stock price up before the
Mhm.
merger goes through, and then whenever they have to go and buy the stocks in the market, they'll have to pay a higher price.
That's perfect. Now, these new shareholders, let's refer to them as arbitrageurs. There is an entire collection of these mergers arbitrageurs. So there is this entire collection of mergers arbitrageurs. What they effectively do is that, so let's think about it this way. The price of the target is meant to be less than the price of the target plus the value of synergies. Or actually, let me change that. Let me just call that price of synergies, right? Because the idea of a merger itself, or even this, in this case, a tender offer, because merger is a more generic term, is that there should be some value generated by either synergy or control, which actually adds value to the underlying target. Now, there's a big difference between these two values. Typically, this has to be large, otherwise the merger is not worth it. You are going to incur a large amount of legal costs. You're going to incur a very large amount of, other fees in the whole process. Not to mention that as an acquirer, as we found out, you're typically going to lose a bit of value. So what happens is that these arbitrageurs then come in if there's a leak, and then they will start shorting this or selling the company's stock at this price and buying at this price. So they will try to take advantage of this gap between the price of, the gap between the price of the target and the price of this of the target plus the price of synergies. And as a result of that, as Sultan correctly pointed out, you these arbitrages will essentially end up artificially boosting up the cost of this, company to the point where gains from mergers for Microsoft will start disappearing. So, which is why having the element of surprise is useful. Now, another reason why having an element of surprise is because of the fact that if this doesn't work out to be a friendly transaction, if Microsoft does not want to sell, as an example, in that case, you will actually end up with a situation where Microsoft will start taking takeover defenses. So it will start, destroying value of itself or engaging in other versions, so that basically this gain from synergies will not accrue to Microsoft at all, will not accrue to Apple at all. So, which is one disadvantage of this friendly tender offer. One major advantage of this is obviously the certainty. You're sitting together as two companies and you're deciding on the long term strategies, and that makes a big difference in terms of your overall outcomes. Now, suppose the friendly takeover does not succeed, then what do we do? So, Microsoft says to Apple that you are not allowed to approach our shareholders and buy. In that case, the solution would be to go hostile. So essentially, hostile approaches. Here I refer to hostile approaches rather than hostile tender offer for a very simple reason. There are different versions of approaches which are not necessarily tender offers. So the first one is bear hug, which doesn't necessarily sound very hostile, but nonetheless, what it essentially does is Apple actually, let's change that, because one company which is very well known for making public announcements is Tesla. So suppose Tesla is taking over GE. GE's management says that we do not want to sell to Tesla because they are our main competitor. So what Tesla will do is it will publicly announce its plan to take over GE. So that might attract things like lawsuits, pressure from institutional investors, and arbitrages. Now, I have a question. Why would there be lawsuits? So let's take a step back in that case. Who would be doing the lawsuits?
Uh, I'm not sure, but maybe the shareholders, because the management at some point it's obliged to take the offer to the shareholders to decide.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. So a company has fiduciary duty towards its shareholders. What it means is that a company's management is obliged by law to actually increase the value of shareholders. Now, if GE is not taking all the actions necessary to create value for its shareholders, and Tesla's plan is going to create a lot of value for GE, and I think there's some version of this where I can point. Okay, I can't find it, but let it be. So if Tesla's plan is going to create value for GE, in that case, what we would see is that the shareholders of GE would go and start suing GE. And shareholder lawsuits are quite, um, there's a big debate surrounding that, in the sense, do they really create value or do they destroy value for the companies? And shareholders do sue the companies, especially now with greater degree of shareholder activism. The other dimension is institutional investor pressure, which is where institutional investors are these very large investors who at this point are holding the last amount percentage, actually data point I'm aware of, was approximately 70% of all the stock market. These are shareholders who often even hold different companies at the given time. So a phone call from one of these institutional investors can put a lot of pressure on the management. And finally, arbitrageurs. As we discussed, they can sell and then they can buy, so they can drive up the prices. So a bear hug is a bit more like the company by itself doesn't do anything. In this case, Tesla will just go to media, as it often does in many cases, and it will just say that, well, we want to take over GE. Yeah. Now, one example, another way where without approaching the shareholders, the acquirer, so in this case, Tesla is the acquirer, and GE is the target, can actually effect change or take control of GE, the Tesla can take control of GE, is by proxy contest. So at any given point, there are these public elections of members of board of executives. And in those elections, different shareholders can throw their weight behind different executives. So instead of directly going to the shareholders, what Tesla can do is it can go to the management of GE, and it can try to essentially take control of the management of the target. One very famous example of this is where Carl Icahn took over control of Blockbuster, which is by itself quite a bankrupt company at this point. But nonetheless, he actually pushed out the CEO of Blockbuster at that point by replacing board members on the company. There's actually this very nice Harvard Business Review article where the CEO of Blockbuster talks about his experience in, in defending himself from a proxy contest. So, what a proxy contest does is that instead of going to the shareholders, because any company consists of the management and the owners, a portion of those owners consist of the shareholders. So, what instead of going to the management, the company goes, sorry, instead of going to the owners, the company goes to the management. And I once again made this a mistake, sorry about that. But yeah, you get the idea. So, the
Sorry,
management,
Professor.
because it has, yeah.
But how can an outside company like Tesla change the management of G, for example?
So what it often does is so as an example, if it does have a certain so most of these companies, as an example, Tesla, they have some ownership. They are not starting from zero. They are starting from a certain amount of percentage of ownership within the firm. What they do, because in many countries, especially in countries like the US, much less so within Europe, the ownership, by Europe, I mean more so continental Europe rather than UK, the ownership is very diffuse, which means that the shareholders are often retail investors or institutional investors who are not particularly paying attention in many cases to these companies. So, what a company like Tesla will do is it will use its block very effectively, or it will organize other block holders effectively to try to change the management. And in many cases, this proxy contest works well because of the fact that typically companies become targets of takeovers because of the fact that they are not being run properly. So, as an example, in the case of Blockbuster, the owner, the CEO, the company was not happy with him. The shareholders were not happy with him. So when Carl Icahn came in, already there was support for kind of kicking him out. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, great. So these two are more so hostile approaches, which do not necessarily translate into uh, direct appeal to the shareholders. But the other way you can do this is just go back to the old version, which is try to get 50.1% of the stake. So once again, Tesla approaches GE's shareholders and tries to take 50.1% of the stake in the company, and then it becomes majority shareholders. This can work three different ways, and I will not go into too much detail because I realize we have been doing a lot of theory, at least at this point. I want to get to one of the case studies, but one way is just to go to one of the large shareholders, but that might be prevented by equal treatment laws, which effectively say that you cannot treat different shareholders differently when you're approaching them. These laws vary very widely within the US itself and also within the continental Europe, so it depends. The other dimension is you just start doing open market purchases, which is you just approach retail investors and start buying their shares. But this can be legal in different jurisdictions. And the final version is hostile tender offers. These are the most public and most well known, which is where you directly purchase the stock from shareholders to gain a majority stake. And these are typically more aggressive than creeping tenders. Creeping tenders are a bit more silent, whereas hostile tender offers are large scale buyouts of very big chunks of, say, GEs in this case, shareholders. Yeah. And these can be one-tiered or multi-tiered. So I want to go through this because I want to give you an idea of one of the issues which a company explain this basically, because one of the reasons why a company actually engage in multi-tiered tender offers. So what a one-tiered tender offer means is that no matter who the shareholder is, I give them, say, $50. Multi-tiered tender offer means that suppose the first 100 million shareholders, this is shares rather, are I give them $50 and the remaining I give, say, $30. So I discriminate between the first movers. This is basically to make these 100 million rush, and they punish the late movers. In many places, once again, this is illegal. Why? Because of the equal treatment laws, which say that you cannot treat different merger parties differently. So why do firms engage in multi-tiered hostile tender offers? And this is actually a bit more of the economics of what tender offers are. So once again, thank you to, I think, Pedro, and I realize there are many people with that name in this call, but still who suggested this, but this is very helpful to write on the slides. So let us consider a toy version where, say, there's the company Tesla once again, which happens to be the acquirer, and GE, which is the target. Now, Tesla offers GE's shareholders, say, $40. The current trading price, so current price, is $34 of GE, of course. The price offered is $40, and the price with synergies, that is the true price, and this is what we will actually cover in the next class, how to estimate the synergies, is $48. So as a shareholder of GE, you face this decision matrix. Where you can either sell or you can hold. Now, if there is a successful takeover, then essentially, what is the amount that you're going to get? You're going to get $40 because that's the amount that is being offered. If there's an unsuccessful, basically it doesn't succeed, then in that case, you're going to receive $34, which is the current price. You're not going to have any appreciation in value. Now, if you hold and it is successful, then you're going to get all the value with the synergies. Because in this case, the person who sells is not going to accrue this additional 8, which is going to be accruing in the longer run. And if you're unsuccessful over here, you end up once again with 34. So for those of you who have done game theory, this is very similar to prisoner's dilemma, wherein there's basically a superior outcome, but because of coordination issues, the superior outcome is not realized. And also, this reminds us of the free rider problem, which is where this person is trying to free ride on all the people who sell and wants to realize the synergy. But because everyone wants to be in this quadrant, this upper quadrant, because of that, you essentially end up with a situation where nobody sells. So this is the one-tiered approach.
Sorry,
yeah.
I don't get why if you hold there's 48 and if you sell it's 40.
So if you sell, the price which is offered is $40. Sorry about that. Every time I touch something, everything goes awry. But the price offered is $40. and the price with synergies is $48. So Tesla is actually not paying the full value, right? And it typically wouldn't want to, because if it pays $48, then as such, it's giving up all the value, right?
Yeah, but we spoke last class that usually they tend to overpay because they think that it's undervalued. So, like in the beginning of the class, we said that, right?
Mm-hmm.
That companies tend to overpay. Then I don't. Yeah, sorry, I'm not getting why it's different when
You're
selling.
you're very you're very absolutely right about that dimension. But nonetheless, if for instance Tesla, so this is more so of an illustrative example. This is not to say that Tesla is not going to offer $50 as an example, where everyone will just end up going to this quadrant.
Okay.
So one of the reasons why actually everyone sells is because this typically is $50. But this is more so of an illustrative example as to why companies go for a multi-tiered approach. So I completely agree with you that most of the cases you do end up with this quadrant being something like $50. Now, in this toy example, and I completely take Madalena's point on board, in this toy example, everyone wants to be on this dimension. And also one more thing is that this price with synergy is something that does not necessarily have to be the real price. It is just something to be the perceived price with synergies, because it's not as though either the seller or the buyer are fully rational. It's perfectly possible that even this could be an overvaluation, and this is also an overvaluation. But it's more so what the seller and buyer believe. So in any negotiation, it's much more so about belief. And also to add to one more side, the straw example can be realized because, as we also discussed in last class, on average, companies do end up losing value, but there is also a distribution where at the tail end, companies do not necessarily always overpay. So there are certain exceptions that we also discussed, but nonetheless, I see your point. So now in this case, what is happening is that everyone wants to be in this quadrant. And it's perfectly possible that both of these cases, this one and this one, the upper row is overpaying. But nonetheless, because both parties believe that this is the true value, that is holding is the true value, they will all want to be in this quadrant and nobody will pay. So this is the free rider problem here. Which is everyone wants to free ride on the people who sell. So the multi-tiered approach, what it says is that first X percentage or X million or whatever, people basically will get, say, $54. And the remaining 1 minus X will get a much worse price, say just $40. Now, what we need to be true is essentially that this by itself needs to be greater than 48. Why? Because we want to get all the people who are in this quadrant and we want to move them here, at least some of them. So we want to eliminate the free rider problem. And this percentage, if you calculate it, I think if I remember correctly when I did the math, it was 4 by 7. So 4/7 of all tender which is going to be made needs to be with 54, and the remaining 3/7, so 1 minus 4/7, needs to be with 40. Now, what happens in this case is we end up with a new decision matrix wherein this value, I'm sorry for the slightly messy situation, but the tender is somewhere like $54 by X plus 40 multiplied by 1 minus X, and the holding dimension is 48. Now this is 34, and this is once again 34. This is successful, this is unsuccessful. Now, because this is greater than this, all the people who were the free riders are incentivized to be amongst the first X percentage, and which is why they end up on this side. And that is one of the reasons why companies often go for a multi-tiered approach when they go for hostile tenders. So to actually address Madalena's point once again, it's not necessary that this is actually the true value or this is the true value price with synergies. Because if we think about game theory, neither of these need to be actually the correct values. What we need to know is that both the seller and the buyer believe these to be the correct values. Now, this is just an illustrative example, and this will not be in your exams. So no need to worry about that if you didn't understand. But this is more so to give you an idea of how the structures of different deals are often constructed by these acquirers when they are approaching the targets. Okay, are there any questions so far? No? Okay. So I wanted to also provide you with an idea of a flowchart. Basically, if you were, say, going to engage in a bid, then where would you start? Would you directly go for a hostile takeover, or would you just, go for a friendly takeover? So what typically happens is, let's just start with the flowchart over here. The company, the bidder, in this case, Tesla, starts up over here. They go for, say, an initial query. So there are a large number of different participants in the mergers and acquisition process, say people like investment banks, other investors, shareholders, and so on. So through these investment banks and so on, they can often make an initial query to the target board, which does not necessarily have to be public, because obviously they don't want to drive up the price. But nonetheless, it has to be elicit a serious response. So what happens in that case is that if the target board says yes, then they just move for the friendly takeover direction. If they say no, there are two options. One is just walk away. You think that it's not worth your time to engage with this hostile takeover, or you just take a more aggressive approach. So in that case, you can choose the options that we discussed so far, which is bear hug, proxy fight, or you simply directly do something like a creeping tender. In this case, for some reason, they call it open market purchase. And then you can also go directly for a tender offer and proxy fight, or simply a tender offer, or you can go for litigation. Litigation is something we have not covered because it's also something that we cannot directly value, but nonetheless, it is very much the case that if Tesla happens to be the shareholder of GE, as the shareholder, they can sue Tesla, they can sue GE because of the fact that they are not maximizing the value. And then they can engage in a tender offer, or they can move towards, but the target can respond once again, and then they can, if the target says no, then they can move towards a tender offer, or they move towards a negotiated settlement, which is once again friendly. So this is friendly, and these are all hostile outcomes. So this is more so to give you an idea, both of these slides, the previous one and this one, of how exactly a given company, a target, will be approaching the acquirer. It's not simply that a target just decides out of the blue that they are just going to make this decision to approach the go for a hostile takeover or a friendly takeover. They often approach the target board. But having said that, one thing which is not covered in this flowchart is that you can literally start over here. Why? Because many cases, it might just be less costly. So there's also that dimension. If it's less costly to, directly approach with the hostile takeover, companies can go directly for the hostile takeover. So we have a few more slides of theory, and then we'll go directly to the sort of mini case study, if you call that. Now, we talked about mergers, and we talked about friendly mergers, which is where two companies get together, the acquirers board approves, the targets board approves, and then basically the shareholders approve. But then there's another dimension, which is a two-step merger, or what is referred to in many cases as a back-end merger. So what the target does in this case is Tesla will go to GE, and it will, via a very, very hostile takeover, take over GE's shareholders. So it will try to take the majority stake. And once it becomes the majority shareholder, it will squeeze out the rest of the shareholders. And then, because it is the majority shareholder, so now Tesla is the majority shareholder, obviously in its own company, but also the majority shareholder in GE. So, and it also controls the boards of these both companies if it wants to. So if it can affect a merger quite simply because it has taken over the GE through a hostile way. So in that case, there is a friendly merger through a very, very hostile first stage. So this first stage is hostile, but through that hostile takeover, GE has now become basically Tesla's and become under Tesla's control. And as a result of that, Tesla and GE can merge. Now, if you remember the first slide, and it's perfectly fine if you don't, but let me just very quickly go there. There are multiple ways that a company can have post-closing organization. There are also multiple ways through which the A plus B can go to B or C. So from the beginning to the outcome, that is, it can go through the acquisition vehicles. So it is not necessary that merger is necessarily the only way that Tesla will operate GE. There's a very good chance that Tesla can just create a holding company out of GE, wherein GE is under Tesla's control, but is not fully integrated into Tesla. There's also a possibility that GE basically becomes a subsidiary of Tesla. So there are multiple ways that once Tesla has control over GE, it can proceed. And there are advantages of actually creating, say, a holding company or subsidiary, which is, say, lower cost or price pressure. But on the other hand, you are kind of managing another company instead of integrating it into your own company. And as a result of that, you are incurring more cost. So it really depends on what the strategic goals of the company are when, after it takes over GE, what it decides to do with it. Okay. So actually, I think let me first finish the asset purchase, and then I will come back to the mini case study, if you don't mind. So far we covered mergers. We covered stock purchases, stock tenders, which were hostile or friendly, and mergers also had a hostile first stage. Now, Tesla does not necessarily have to take over. It doesn't have to bother with the management, the integration, and so on. What it can do instead is it can take GE's assets. What these assets mean is not necessarily just one particular, portion of basically one equipment in GE. It could very well mean that Tesla is going to take over GE's entire production line. So GE's electric car line as an example. And if GE as an example does not want to continue with the production line, then it will sell it to Tesla quite happily. So in this case, the asset purchase, instead of taking over the whole company and forming a new legal entity, or taking over the company by taking over the shares, you directly go to the management and you take the assets of the company. These assets, in this case of Tesla and GE, would be the production line as an example, or maybe just the electrics division or subsidiary. If for an example, within Disney and Pixar, it could very well just be, well, Pixar is just an animation company, but to suppose Pixar was taking over GE's Disney's assets, then in that case, it could take over Disney's animation side. So Pixar, instead of taking over Disney, which is a much larger company, but this is just an example, could very well just, take over a portion of it. So once again, this can be done via cash or stock. We will get in the next portion to exactly how this goes through. Now, what it can do is that the target of many times often dissolves itself and proceeds, that is basically whatever the target receives, the management receives, goes to a shareholder. So in this case, Tesla is not going to GE's shareholder, it's going to its management and saying that basically sell me your assets. This is very suitable, as we already discussed, for production lines or divisions. And it also depends on the local law. There is a wide variation within law. And unfortunately, the vast majority of this, what I found, was mainly in the US. And I imagine a lot of you are not going to practice there. So I have tried to stay as much away from the S corporation, C corporation over there, because laws do vary very widely across countries. Now, the acquirer may or may not assume target liabilities. Again, that depends on the goals of the acquirer, but in all cases, it definitely takes over the assets. So that's an asset purchase. So we covered the mergers, the stocks, and the asset purchase. Let's just go to an example, and then we can get to the case study. So this is Washington Mutual. If you remember, during the last financial crisis, a lot of companies started going bankrupt. And many of these companies were then seized by regulatory agency. So the FDIC is one of the main financial regulatory agencies, amongst others within the US. What companies like JP Morgan, which were actually doing well and which were better managed before the financial crisis did, was they went to all these companies which were basically seized or already under liquidation and so on, and they just bought them off. And in this particular case, what JP Morgan did was that it took over the company's assets and then it dissolved the company, Washington Mutual. Washington Mutual, which at that point, if I remember correctly, was a savings company. So many of these companies during the last financial crisis took advantage of the undervalued asset or dirt cheap assets. As we discussed last time, one of the dimensions of motives for mergers is undervaluation. And on average, acquirer loses out, but that is not always the case. But still, in this case, the company was taken over through an asset purchase. All right, are there any questions so far?
Professor.
Yeah.
I didn't understand like what happens to the shareholders of the acquired company. They keep their shares in this case of
the asset purchase.
Yeah.
Okay, so in the asset purchase, it really depends. Asset purchase can take multiple forms. So it can very well be that you take over a division of a company. So in this case, say Tesla might very well just take over a division, the electric division of GE, in which case what it will do is that it will sort of buy out potentially with cash, say in this case, the division. The cash will then go to GE, and GE typically would distribute them to the target shareholders, but it may not necessarily do that. But there's another version where the Tesla will just buy the assets of GE, leave it as a shell, where there's nothing inside the company anymore because all the assets have been taken over, and pay the company, say, cash or stock, and the shell company then liquidates. So in case of Washington Mutual and many of these financial companies which were taken over, in most cases, they were liquidated. So it really depends. The asset purchase does not necessarily have to liquidate the target company. Yeah.
But what does imply the liquidation of the company?
So liquidation basically means the company dissolves. It doesn't exist anymore. So the management completely dissolves, all dimensions of the company dissolve, and then the shareholders get whatever the proceeds are, and then the company doesn't exist. So instead of, say, taking over the company and keeping all the workers or so on, you kind of just take over the assets and then dissolve the rest of the company.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Oliver, I see you have raised your hand.
Yeah, I wanted to ask regarding the liabilities, because in the example of JP Morgan Chase, it was mentioned that they only had to acquire certain liabilities attached to the assets. And I wonder how it is legally, because the debt holders, they could be in a disadvantage if the acquirer of all the assets wouldn't need to take over all the liabilities as well. So I wonder why they only had to take certain liabilities of the acquired company.
So one thing which is a bit of a bias in this course as well as in all the courses in finance that you will do is typically we talk about shareholders. But the collection of people who have the preferential rights to any gains from a company when it goes bankrupt are the debt holders, right? So while it is entirely true that if you don't take over the liabilities, that the debt holders are on their own, when you're taking over the assets, whatever money is coming through is first going to all the debt holders. So in that sense, the debt holders are always going to be paid first, then all the preferred stocks, and then basically the general stockholders. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you too.
Okay. So what I would suggest is the following. I imagine all of you have the slides, and if you do not have the slides, then let me know. I will share them in the chat over here. Also, remember that some people were not able to access the chat. So please do let me know when we take a break later, how's that working out, because I want to fix that issue. But let's do this. Read through the case study and look at the questions, and I'll give you around, I guess, 10 minutes. This is a short time. It will easily extend to 15 minutes, but still, let's just start off at 10 minutes and then just think through the answers. Now, the third questions, I do not necessarily expect you to know the answer because we have not covered that as of now, but read through it. And if you do not have a slide, actually unmute yourself and let me know so that I can share the slides with you in the chat. I hope I can do that actually. Okay, something very funky has happened with my Teams as usual, so I'll have to leave the call on this device. Okay, is everyone done reading or do you need 5 more minutes?
Done.
Okay, good. Then let's go through the case study together. I mean, it's a very, very small case study. Typically, you will be coming across quite large case studies later on, which have like full balance sheets and so on. So okay. So in this case, you have got this company, Vivendi. I think maybe I can keep this on the second slide and just write here. Yeah. So you've got a company, Vivendi, and Vivendi is selling its division, which is View, to General Electric's corporation's subsidiary. NDC. Now, first of all, I mean, this is a relatively easy question. Who is the acquirer in this case and who is the target?
G, the acquire, and the other Vivendi is a target.
That's exactly right. So it's a relatively simple question because it does say over here that it is Vivendi who is selling its assets to General Electric. Now, what it says is that Vivendi received a combination of stock and it should not stock as GE stock and stock in the combined company valued at approximately $14 billion. So this is a slightly more complicated, actually, transaction approach. What it says is that, let me zoom in a bit, then maybe the page turning will stop. So Vivendi basically received both GE stock as well as the stock in the combined company, that is View plus NBC, and that was to the tune of $14 billion. Not sure why this is happening. Okay, let's go back to, sorry, there's always going to be some technical issues from my end, so you'll just have to bear with me. So Vivendi has View and GE has NBC. Now, what Vivendi is doing is it's selling its division to NBC, and that works out to roughly $14 billion, where it's receiving that in terms of a more complex transaction in stocks of different versions. So this is essentially a stock-based transaction where Vivendi shareholders would be receiving stocks in return for selling the division. Now, what is the form of yeah, sorry, Jose, you had a question?
In this case, can we assume that the target is just Vivendi Universal Entertainment and that the seller is Vivendi Universal? Because sometimes, like Bloomberg or Merger Market, they defer the seller and the target.
You're very right. So this would be technically the seller. This would be the target. But the reason why we would say that, okay, let's first answer the second question. But the reason why I hesitate to call this actually even a target is because of the nature of this transaction in this case. But what would be the answer to the second question? That is, what is the form of acquisition? I can see a couple of people have their hands up. So if you have an answer or a question or something like that, just unmute yourself, because sometimes it gets a bit complicated.
Basically my question is the following. So you said that the acquirer is GE, but I mean, I get it because GE owns NBC, of course, but like from strictly a legal point of view, wouldn't it be like NBC?
Yeah.
Because NBC is in fact the company that is acquiring a division of Vivendi, right?
Yes, you're very much right. So I see a lot of you have a bit of experience on this mergers dimension. So yes, you're perfectly right. It is NBC who is acquiring View, because it is the subsidiary of GE who is actually acquiring View. But because GE is the larger company, yes, I mean, you could argue that for our valuation purposes, you could call it the buyer or the acquirer. But nonetheless, from a strictly legal standpoint, you're absolutely right. Okay, so what is the answer to the second question? What is the form of acquisition? And basically, first, let's start there. What is the form of acquisition?
It's an asset purchase.
Exactly right. So what is happening over here is that this is an asset purchase where NBC is, or GE rather, its subsidiary, is purchasing View, which is a division. So asset does not necessarily have to be like the machinery or so on. It can be an entire division. And why might this form have been agreed to by the parties involved in transaction? But before that, I think, Vasco, do you have a question, or did you leave the raised hand up?
Oh, no, sorry, I left my hand up.
Okay, so why would these parties agree to this specific portion? So we so far covered stock purchases, we covered mergers, and we covered asset purchases. Why would they go for an asset purchases rather than going for a stock or a merger?
I think we saw we saw in the case that Vivendi has a lot of different is operating in a lot of different areas. So in the case of GE, they were just interested in the part of the Universal Studio, and because the Vivendi is a water company, so probably
Exactly. So sorry to cut you off, but that is precisely why this form has been agreed to by the parties over here. So the reason is because GE and Vivendi are both very large companies. It's not as though GE wants to necessarily acquire. This is a very targeted purchase. What GE wants to do is create synergies or get control by, or actually, what do they say in the I think they talk about synergies. So it wants to get control of this particular division, which happens to be its entertainment division, with its entertainment division. So it's merging, trying to get control of this particular section. It doesn't want to take over the entire company. So there is a bit more of a targeted purchase which is happening in this case rather than doing a full scale merger, which might actually create negative value because these are two very large companies. And one of the things, if you remember from the last class, was that when large companies often acquire large companies, then you, in many cases, end up with very bad outcomes in terms of the returns because of the integration issues. So in this particular case, it would be NBC, which is acquiring View, rather than taking up the whole company, because that might actually create negative value. I guess a couple of you had your hands raised. I'm sorry I did not get to you. So do you still want to ask? Just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. No? Okay. So now, what is the form of payment or total consideration? And do you believe that the parties agreed to the transaction, agreed to the form of payment? So actually, we can answer this question because now when I look at it, it's not necessarily linked to what we are going to, it's based on pretty much what we have covered. So what is the form of payment? And do you think that why do you believe that the parties agreed to this form of payment?
We can see that Vivendi had some liquidity problems due to high leverage. So I believe that the form of the payment was in order to help Vivendi face, because it was 4 billion in cash, 1.6 in debt transfer to attach to the assets that they sold. And I believe that it was just to cover his liquidity problems.
But yeah, that makes sense. And the form of payment in this case is 4 billion in cash and 1.6 billion in debt. Are there any other perspectives on this?
Professor, I think you wanted to say 14 billions in cash and 28 in stocks, no? The form of payment?
Let me actually check. Sorry for this. I myself have lost my place in this.
Well, I think it's 4 billion in cash and 1.6.
Sorry, I made a mistake over there. Sorry about that.
I think they also received 20% in the newly created subsidiary.
Yes. So all of you are ahead of me in this, but yes, you're right. I lost my place in this, and I apologize. So it is very much, it is a combination of liquidity boost, which comes through with, actually, let me start off here. Okay. So the final transaction, from what I can see, works out to 5.6 billion in liquidity, which consists of 4 billion in cash, 1.6 billion in debt transfer, and you also receive 20% in as a stake in the new company. So that would be the overall final payment mode. But in terms of sheer payment, that is actual transfers being made right now, that would work out to 4 billion in cash and 1.6 billion in debt. And then it would be receiving this 20% ownership in stock. So to return to this, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I myself lost my place for a little bit. Basically, why do you believe that the parties agreed to this form of payment? We will be actually returning to this a bit later, but if you have an answer, I'm more than keen to hear it now.
I think this is almost the answer to the last question. Why Vivendi just have 20%? It's because they needed liquidity, so they opt for getting cash first and not the shares. So I think that is almost the answer.
That makes perfect sense. But then why would they also maintain 20% in stock?
I think the stock part ensures that GE doesn't overpay because the seller, in this case Vivendi, also participates in the future operations of the newly created subsidiary.
That is right.
It's almost splits the risk of this transaction.
That is perfectly right. So the way this whole purchase is laid out, and actually we'll cover this just in a little bit, is that it works out to a mixture of liquidity, which is immediate payment. So that gives us very low risk. So risk with this cash transaction is very low because cash is cash. Eventually, it works out to basically a sure payment. That is very much a right answer. But there are two dimensions to this 20% side. The first side comes from the fact that this 20% is essentially giving Vivendi a stake in future synergies, but it's also giving from NBC's side or GE's side, if you would believe it, if you consider the larger company, it also sort of distributes the risk. Now, there are two more things over here. I'm very confused as to what's happening here. So there are two more things over here. The first one is that Vivendi had the option to sell its 20% ownership interest in the future. So if you have done, like, say, option pricing in the past, then this more or less works out to an option within the payment, which also mitigates the risk from Vivendi's side at fair market value. But from GE's side, it also has an option, which is that it would have the first right. So within this, both the parties have sort of mitigated their risk by having this option in place. So you have, I'm sorry for going all over the place with this, you have this cash and the other debt payment, but you also have these two options within this, which comes more so from the equity side or the stock side, which themselves are not just free floating because equity prices can fluctuate, exposing you to a lot of risk. But there is some bound on this risk because of the fact that Vivendi as well as GE have created these options for themselves. Yeah. Okay. I will give you a break because I realize we have been for 1.5 hours at this point. But I also wanted to ask a few more questions. This is just more so for clarification. So it says applying a multiple of 14 times estimated 2003 EBITDA. What exactly is this? And it also says multiple is within the range of comparable transactions. This is actually kind of preempting the next lecture, but still, what exactly is this?
Valuation method.
Exactly. So this is a valuation method which is built upon multiples analysis, where you take comparable firms and you use the comparable firms in the industry, and then you value your own company. Now, it also says over here, that this is accretive for shareholders beginning in the second year. What does this mean? Accretion as a term. And the opposite of that, dilution.
Well, basically, accretion means that after the merger, the earnings per share are rising, whereas dilution is the other way around, that the earnings per share are decreasing.
Perfect. So accretion and dilution are both linked to earning per share. Why earning per share? Because earning per share is one of the best metrics in the sense that it tells us as a shareholder how much claim we have, how much claim we have to the profits of the company. So as an individual for per share, so that works out to earnings per share. So when earnings per share increases, then there's accretion. When earning per share decreases, then there's dilution. So that's the idea of accretion and dilution. So it is around 11 o'clock. I think you guys have already been here for around 90 minutes. We will cover the last question a bit later in the class. If I forget, please do remind me. And right now, let's take around 15-20 minute break and then return. I'll be still on call. So if you have any questions or if you have any comments or otherwise, or any administrative questions, feel free to ask. So let's meet once again at 11:15. Yes, Jose?
Yeah, Professor, could you give us the password to enroll in the Moodle class, in the Moodle?
I think it was hostile takeover. So let me actually check.
You can also find it under the announcements in Moodle.
Yeah, because I actually haven't turned off the guest access as of yet.
It's hostile takeover. I check it now.
Okay, perfect.
It is. So see ya.
Okay, thank you. Work for me as well.
Yes, please do enroll yourself. From my end, personally, I don't care keeping the desktop access on throughout the semester, but apparently there's some protocol surrounding that, so I don't want to break that protocol. I think someone has a question. If you have a question, please just ask. Unmute yourself and feel free to ask, because from my end, it's very difficult to actually to get any hold on my Teams. It somehow is not working really well on my Mac.
Yeah, sure, no problem. I just wanted to ask if you were going to re-upload the slides with your annotations, which would be a big help if you would.
Sure. I actually thought my annotations would not be a big help because I'm just drawing arrows everywhere, but sure, I can do that. I also have uploaded the last recording for the first lecture, so I will be uploading the recording for the Friday lecture. So you'll also see these annotations there.
Okay, thanks.
I hope you guys can access the recording, because the OneDrive, it was not exactly, I think some people had access issues with the OneDrive. So,
Professor, good morning. Sorry to bother. For the group project, how many members should there be?
So I will make a separate announcement for that as well, but it can be anywhere between 1 and 6 people. If you are going to go with 6 people, anywhere between 4 4, 5, and 6, then you will have to answer one more question, obviously, because there are economies of scale. If
Okay.
you're going with one person, there will be a bit more of lenient grading as well as
Two people.
basically fewer questions to answer.
Okay. Okay. Perfect. Thank you. And it can be from different sections, students from different sections.
Yes, from my end, I'm not very familiar with the administration end of things, but from my end, I do not mind at all if it's from different sections because it makes no difference.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I think in other lectures, other courses, are you guys allowed to make groups between different sections?
Most of them.
Okay, then it works the exact same way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we are just not allowed when we have to work in the class.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense because obviously sections are created for maintaining group size, but you're not going to be in a lecture room discussing your group assignments, so that shouldn't be an issue.
Perfect. Thanks.
Professor, quick question. Why might be a creeping tender might be illegal?
So it first of all has to do a bit more with the what's it called? Sorry, I lost
Equal
my
treatment.
the equal treatment laws. So basically, you might actually start buying certain shareholders before others. So that is one of the reasons why it's illegal. Then also beyond that, there are other jurisdictions often have their own exact laws surrounding mergers, which do not necessarily follow logic on that dimension. So there are other reasons where the regulatory authorities want to prevent, say, mergers which are not necessarily being publicly announced, which might hurt the value of the shareholder. Because what happens in the creeping tender is that the acquirer does not fully announce it. And as a result of that, it might start acquiring all the shares of that company at a lower value than actually what should be the value it should be paying. So even on that dimension, many jurisdictions might make it illegal.
Okay, thank you.
Professor?
Yeah.
I enrolled in the course in the beginning of the add-on drop period with the guest access, and since I'm already enrolled with the guest access, this type of access is still permitted. I am not able to fully enroll like with the password you just said like a few minutes ago.
Okay.
Like I'm just enrolled as a guest, and I cannot like cancel it and properly enroll.
Okay, but you guys, all of you, I presume, have received the email, right? Which has the password in it.
Yeah. It's hostile
Okay.
takeover. Yeah, I've seen it.
Okay, so the reason why I am saying that is because if I turn off the guest access, then automatically you will be removed from the access, and then you can re-enroll.
Yeah, I mean, I received it. I don't know if everyone received it, but I think so.
I think technically, if you're in the course and you have guest access, then you should be receiving it because even I receive my own announcements. So yeah.
I haven't received, Professor, but like I asked a friend for the enrollment key actually.
So actually, let me check the enrollment key and let me type it here in the chat. Because I think even if I revoke your guest access on Moodle, you will still have access to the Teams. So as a result of that, you will not have that sort of an issue.
Mm-hmm.
So let me see. Yeah.
Sorry, Professor, I missed some parts. Did you share the syllabus with us or?
Yes, I thought that you get the syllabus because so the syllabus per se is already there in the week by week breakdown, but I thought you already got the access to a syllabus through some other system because I received quite a few emails about the syllabus. But if you're not getting the access, then do let me know because then I'll upload the PDF to the Moodle as well.
All right, thanks. I'm gonna check and maybe email you.
Yeah, because I do know that there's one more system on which I had to upload the syllabus, so it was something else, but I'm not entirely sure how the syllabus thing works, which is why I didn't upload it again here. But I can upload it later on the Moodle as well.
All right, thank you.
No worries. Okay, so I would say I know it's just been 15 minutes, but if everyone is here, then we can maybe start off because unfortunately in this class we have a lot to cover. So it would be good if we can start off. Otherwise, I can give you around 5 minutes to look through. Yeah, that doesn't make sense. I think I'll anyway. Okay, so it is 11:20. Our 20-minute break is up. So far we have covered how exactly we choose the form of merger, whether it should be merger or a takeover via stocks or takeover of stocks, or whether it should be assets. Now the question arises, how do we exactly pay for this? So do we pay with stock or do we pay with cash, or would we create a combination of the two as we saw in the case study earlier? And there are multiple determinants for this. Obviously, it has to do with life cycle of the company and other dimensions as well. But one of the main dimensions of this is also tax considerations, wherein basically you can defer capital gain taxation if you pay via stock. Legal form. This is a very American thing, so it's perfectly fine if from a practitioner perspective, it may not be interesting if you're not planning to work there, but typically over there are types of C corporations and S pass-through corporations, and C corporations are subject to double taxation, whereas S corporations are only subject to a single taxation. But nonetheless, the legal form plays a big role in whether or not you get taxed or not. And the biggest dimension is risk. Now, even in the previous case study where we saw, my apologies, it's gone all the way to the beginning. So in the previous case study where we saw, risk was one of the main dimensions of how stock was structured. What that means is that in that particular case, there was a payment with cash, transfer of debt, and takeover of stock. And the stock came with strings attached where you could not sell it to other parties because basically GE or NBC in this case had the first right to buy or refuse to buy it, whereas at the same time, Vivaldi had a right to essentially sell it in a future time as well. So risk plays a big role in how the payment is being determined. The reason why tax matters is because of capital gains, especially because capital gains are those gains that you realize upon selling an asset. So if you're selling, as an example, your stock, then you realize capital gains. And if you realize it in form of cash, then you have to pay taxes on it. On the other hand, you can receive it in form of stock. So swap stock for stock, and then you can sell it at a future point. So in many cases, as an example, in venture capital, many times they deliberately postpone their investments in companies simply to avoid these capital gains. Now, vast majority of the plurality of deals rather in the US are stock deals. The certain amount are cash finance and the rest are mixed. If you go in continental Europe, especially in countries like Germany, it is mainly cash finance because there's a culture of strong ownership over there, ownership as in more concentrated ownership. So they are not very keen on dilution of that ownership. So the question over here, as an example, is if we think about the Instagram, Facebook case study or rather the video that we saw last time, one of the things which happened in that case study was that Facebook acquired Instagram at $1 billion. If you remember the interview, that's also what Mark Zuckerberg said. But the final acquisition price turned out to be $750. So what happened was the payment was structured as follows. It was $300 million in cash payment and 23 million shares of Facebook. Now, the share of Facebook declined during the acquisition, which in turn reduced the value of payment received. So simply by the reduction in value of the shares of Facebook, Instagram's owners received much less compensation than what initially they had negotiated. So the question of payment is also linked to who retains risk during and also after deal. In this case, most of the risk was retained by Instagram. Now, we will come across cases where Instagram did not have to actually retain that risk. And there's one particular reading that I will be posting very soon, which actually talks about how it could have avoided that risk. So if we remember this case study, Vivendi had mitigated its risk, and so did GE. In the same way, Instagram very well could have structured its payment in a way that it could have mitigated the risk while getting cash and equity. So it is not necessary that just because you receive equity that you automatically have to take on high amount of risk. You can very well take up equity and mitigate your risk through other contract structures. So the takeaway over here is that form of payment affects risk sharing. So let's go through the two main dimensions. The first one is stock and second one is cash. Let's start off with stock. And let's talk a bit about why basically the pros and cons of stock. And then let's get to the pros and cons of cash. Now, one of the main pros of stock is the risk is shared with the target. If you think that the target is very risky, then you automatically, if the target shareholders are holding on to that stock afterwards, then you're sharing that risk with them. Additionally, you're got capital gains advantages because you can sell off the stock when capital gain incidence is at its lowest for you. And this is mainly for the target because the target receives the stock. And furthermore, convertible preferred stock provides insurance to the target. Now, can anybody tell me what convertible preferred stock is? Okay, so
can you repeat the question?
The question is, what is convertible preferred stock?
Okay.
So preferred stock is stock which has a priority in dividend payments as well as payment in case of bankruptcies. Convertible preferred stock is that stock where you can convert it into cash or you can convert it into cash compensation once it rises above a particular value. So as an example, if you have the stock right now at 40, the stock might very well say at 50, you can sell it to the company and receive this $50. Then in that case, that is convertible. So the thing about preferred stock is that it automatically gives you priority in dividend payments as a target if you receive it. So going back to our case of Tesla and GE, if you receive as GE stock of Tesla, so if you receive the stock of Tesla, in that case, you are going to be guaranteed dividend payments unless the company goes completely bankrupt. Even then, you have a priority in receiving the payment from the bankruptcy proceeds. But if, for instance, if it goes above a particular threshold, then you can just convert it into cash or compensation. So certain types of stocks also create very good structures. And if you have done option pricing in the past, this is very similar to an option, where you have an option to sell, but not an obligation.
So just a small question.
Mm-hmm.
The preferred stockholders receive previous to the debt holders in case of bankruptcy or not?
No. So seniority always starts off with, unless there's some very specific version that I'm not aware of, seniority in debt always starts with the most senior debt to preferred stock and then stock. So as a result of that, as a debt holder, you're the least exposed to risk unless the company goes completely bankrupt, but you're also least, because risk goes both ways, you also don't get the positive side of risk. So preferred stock somewhere falls between the stock and the debt.
Thank you.
Yeah. So those were the plus sides of stocks. The downside of stock is something that we covered in the last class. So signal of acquirer overvaluation. There are some crooks who are actually taking advantage of overvaluation to issue stock, and you really as an investor don't know who are the crooks and who are the more honest companies, then you will think every company which is issuing stock is overvalued. That is, one more side is potential lack of confidence by the acquirer in the merger, because if the merger is going to go really, really well, then why would you want to share the proceeds in the future with the target? You would want to buy out the target completely with a fixed amount. Then there's long-term dilution in earnings per share, which effectively means that whatever claims that you're going to receive from profit, the numerator, the denominator over here, which is the outstanding shares, this is outstanding shares becomes larger. So every individual gets a lower claim. And then there's, of course, specific cases such as cross-border deals, where investors might simply be exposed to risk because of ownership in a foreign country. So those are the plus and the downsides of paying with stock. Of course, the best part about stock is that it's just a claim. It by itself has no value. All the value that is arising is because of the claim on the profit. So in that sense, it's also very cheap. So one more thing you can add over here is that it's cheap. And because it's cheap, you also have this issue. Now, why cash? There is, first of all, as the target, there's lower risk because cash is cash. You can immediately obtain the amount and it's going to be fixed. Think back to the Instagram, Facebook example. If they had received $1 billion in cash, they would be much better off. There's also straightforward valuation because with stock, you have to do that whole complication valuation. You have to do APV, WACC, and so on to identify the stock per share, which is not necessary with cash. And then there's also, from the acquirer side, no dilution of ownership. And this, especially in countries like Germany, as an example, matters a lot because in countries like those, there is not diffuse ownership. There's much more so concentrated ownership. So they prefer there's a preference for cash-based transactions. And if you are confident about potential gains, then you want to pay out with cash. Why? Because in that case, you don't have to pay these shareholders of the target anymore in the future. All the profits simply belong to you. So if you're very confident about synergies, then in that case, cash is the best way to go. The downside of cash is that the acquirer assumes all the risk. Cash is cash, so you pay off, and then you're done. So essentially, if there's any negative downside risk, then you're assuming all the risk. So just as you're getting all the benefit of the upside risk, because risk can go both ways, then you're also getting the downside. There's also immediate tax liability because of capital gains. And in many cases, cash is raised through debt. So as a result of that, if you're already a company with a very high leverage ratio, then you might end up with way too much debt, which you have to pay down. And that might also lead to credit downgrades. One point which I have not actually mentioned over here is that raising debt eventually is compensated with policies like cost cutting. And as an example, one company which has done that recently is Abbey and Sam Miller, where after the acquisition, they have been on a cost-cutting spree. So they are trying to get their leverage ratios down. Yeah. So why don't we go with both? Why not go both with a combination in stock and cash? So if stock gives you too much risk as a target, and cash gives you too little risk, perhaps a combination of both would be good for you. So in this case, what is often the case is that this sort of combination is created so as to increase the appeal to target shareholders. So you have at the same time greater certainty as well as ability to avail of appreciation of acquirer's value. What that means is, if we think back to the Vivendi example, and I hope I remember the name right this time, in that case, Vivendi is getting both the cash, so a down payment, but it's also getting a bit of the equity side. So it has a bit more of the risk, but risk can also go upside. So as a result of that, it also has the positive dimension here. This can also remind you actually of very simple portfolios where you have bond and equity. Of course, it's not the same thing, where you kind of balance out the less risky asset and have a risky asset. So in that sense, stock and cash combinations can work really well. And one place where it works is in bidding settings. So we will actually come across an example of this just in a bit, where when you're in a bidding war with someone else, you cannot immediately issue stock, or you may not be able to immediately issue, get a lot of cash. So in that case, creating a combination portfolio of payment is much better. So I have been talking at breakneck speed so far. Do you guys have any questions, or did I say something which was not clear?
It's fine.
Okay, so let's do one exercise, which is, let's work through this rather than, because it's not so difficult. In this case, we have an acquirer, which is the Blackstone Group, which is an investment management company. The target is a real estate company. And this real estate company is underperforming. So acquirer, Blackstone, target is the EOP, and this has been an underperforming company. Now, Blackstone wants to acquire EOP for $48.5 in cash. And now, after seeing that, let me write that again, actually, I think, yeah. So after seeing that, there's a new company, Vornado, which is a real investment trust, which comes in. By the way, this is not a hypothetical scenario. This was actually one of the first sort of private equity type of transactions into the construction sector. Vornado tries to jump in. And if you remember, Blackstone had offered 48.5. So Vornado is offering $52 per share, but it's offering 60% in cash and rest in its own stock. Now, one technical issue over here is that because it's issuing it in stock, under certain jurisdictions, and especially in this particular case, it has to get the approval of its own shareholders. Whereas Blackstone, because it's paying in cash, does not have to get approval of its own shareholders. It has to get the approval only of EOP's shareholders. Now, Blackstone responds by offering $54 in cash. So remember, this was 52 from Vornado, Blackstone, 48.5. Response is 52, 54. So it's a bidding war. And what it's also curiously asking is to raise the breakup fee, because it's going to breakup fee from $200 million to $500 million. And Vornado's new offer, without changing the structure, is $56 per share. So now Vornado has gone for $56. So we started off with 48.5. Remember, Blackstone is only paying in cash, and Vornado is paying 60% cash, rest in equity, so stock. And Blackstone has come up with this quite weird request where it's asking for higher fee than for some reason. Now, there are two issues here. The first one is that Vornado's payment needs to be approved by their shareholders because they are offering 60% in cash and they are offering roughly 40% in stock. And second is that Vornado is not willing to pay breakup fee. So the increased Blackstone is offering now $55. Where was the last one? 56. Yeah, it's offering $55, $55.5, and it's asking for a higher breakup fee. Now, Blackstone accepts the offer, and Vornado's stock price jumps up while Blackstone's price falls. So let's answer a few questions. But before we do that, and I can hear someone wants to ask a question. So before we do that, let me just recap. Blackstone started off with 48.5. Vornado asked for 52. Blackstone offered 54, I think. Vornado offered 56, 54, and 500 million in this, in breakup fee. Vornado offered 56, and Blackstone is offering 55.5, a lower price, surprisingly, and a higher fee to be paid. Vornado is offering 60% in cash, 40% in stock, and Blackstone is fully cash. And because this is in stock, it has to go through the approval of its shareholders. So take around 5 minutes or 3 or 4 minutes and think about the answers to these questions. Why did Blackstone ask for an increased breakup fee, and what was its strategy? The second question has to do with why did Vornado's stock price increase and Blackstone's price decrease? And what could have Vornado done in this case? This should actually be what could Vornado have done differently in this case? Okay, so it's been around 2 or 3 minutes, which is a bit more than you. I mean, I think these are relatively okay-ish questions. So let's start with the first question. Why did Blackstone ask for an increased breakup fee, and what was its strategy?
I think that Blackstone asked for the increased breakup fee in order to prevent the target from backing out of the deal.
Mm-hmm.
So it will be more expensive to them to accept the Vornado's deal, instead of taking up with them that it's even a lower share price, but if they avoid to pay the breakup fee, they will have a higher value.
But in that case, they first of all don't have to agree to this $500 million breakup fee, right? And in that case, if for instance, Blackstone is trying to hold them hostage, that is Vornado hostage, then, sorry, not Vornado, Blackstone is trying to hold EOP hostage, then in that case, wouldn't EOP simply go for this? That is $56, no breakup fee, instead of $54 and $500 million breakup fee.
And additionally, I think a point that I forget is that since the deal involves shares, there's always the possibility of Vornado's shareholders of not accepting the deal after they after like EOP goes for the Vornado's offer, and they still are liable to the uncertainty of like the shareholders of Vornado not accepting the deal.
That is perfectly right. So Blackstone is using the breakup fee as a tactic. What it is doing is, first of all, it's offering to pay that breakup fee in cash. And if that fee has to be paid in cash, and now it's gone in the final deal to $720 million, if that fee has to be paid completely in cash, then in that case, first of all, Vornado will have to raise the additional cash. But also, if it is basically paying for that using stock, then either it has to issue more stock in case its stock price goes down, so there's dilution, or it has to raise more cash if it doesn't want to dilute its stock. So this is more so like a bargaining chip, where Blackstone is deliberately hurting Vornado's chances by asking for higher breakup fee. Also, because it is willing to pay the breakup fee, EOP simply doesn't seem to care. As a result of that, what it's doing is it's shutting out Vornado by using the $720 million of breakup fee with its cash leverage as a tactic. And I completely agree with your second point, which is that Vornado is basically paying 40% with stock. Stock fluctuates. Also, stock leads to dilution. And also, in this particular case, the stock has to be approved by the shareholders of Vornado before there's some sort of an outcome. In this case, if I remember correctly, it's around 2 to 3 months. So EOP has to also wait. And if anything, if the breakup fee keeps on going up and up, then there's a good chance that the Vornado's shareholders may not accept the final thing. So there's two dimensions. There's first, which is the dimension where it's a tactic. The second dimension, tactic as into increase cost. And the second dimension comes from the tactic also to make sure that, or increase the probability that Vornado's proposal fails with its own shareholders. So for the second question, why did Vornado's stock price increase and Blackstone's price decrease? Because it was actually Vornado who lost and Blackstone who won.
Probably Blackstone could be like overpaying because they started to offer 48, I guess, and they ended paying 55.5.
Perfect.
And
So,
besides,
yeah, sorry.
Besides that, it also says that EOP was doing poorly its performance, so it's not for sure that that Blackstone will be doing better.
I think Pedro also wanted to say something. Okay, so
I think additionally to the Duarte's comment, Since Blackstone is an investment management company and Vornado was from the real estate industry, I think that there's not so much synergies between Blackstone and EOP as we will have with Vornado's. So
that could be a possibility. I'm not entirely sure whether that is the case here, but yes, that I think I like that line of thinking because it goes a bit outside what we typically cover in the course, which is more on the integration side, post-merger integration side. So let me write down your answers. I think someone else also had a question point.
Also to comment, probably to receive in cash was more convenient to the company than receiving 40% in stocks, maybe. So they are able to decrease a bit the price, and yeah.
Let me flip that a bit around. You're onto something on that. Cash is beneficial for the target, but for the acquirer, as an example, if Blackstone has overpaid, then if anything, they have put themselves in a bad position, right? Because they are taking all the risk. So as a result of that, Blackstone's price will decrease. So
they raised the breakup fee, no?
Yes, exactly, and they are paying all of this in cash, so they are taking also all of the risk for themselves. But before Jose, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong the whole time, but do correct me if that is the case. Before you answer, let me just write down some of the points. So first is winner's curse, which is what we covered in the last class. In a bidding war, the winner might end up overpaying. The second probability is the cash payment, which is that it might be incurring too much risk, especially because it's also paying the breakup fee. The third could be post-merger integration.
Sorry, Professor. You just pay, like, Blackstone just pay the breakup fee if they break up the deal or no? Like, if they go ahead and buy EOP, they don't need to pay the fee, or they need?
They need to pay the fee. Wait, hold on. I'll check on that and get back to you. I'm sorry, I don't have the answer immediately.
Oh, no problem.
Yeah, let me just write that down so I don't forget.
My doubt is, like, if in the end Blackstone, I don't know why, but ended without buying EOP, they need to pay the 500 million. But if they really buy EOP,
No, I will check that and get back to you. My apologies, I don't know the answer.
no problem.
Jose or Jose, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name. You had your hand up for a while.
It's Jose. Isn't it the opposite? It's EOP who has to pay Blackstone the fee, right? If they back out of the deal after accepting their offer.
Yeah, I will check on that. I am sorry, I don't know the answer immediately. I will check up on exactly who pays the breakup fee and so on. But my apologies on that. I didn't check that up in advance. But yeah, if you know any better, please do help me out with this one.
Yes, the Investopedia says that the breakup fee is the target who pays in case of going out of the deal. So by raising, probably I'm thinking by raising the breakup fee, Blackstone is getting insurance in some way that the target is not going out, and so they are able to raise the amount of cash they are paying.
Okay. Thank you for that. And once again, apologies for not having checked that up. But if that is the case, then the risk dimension actually doesn't count up. So it's mainly the winner's curse, which is the main dimension. The second dimension comes through from the cash payment and the post-merger integration. As has been pointed out by a couple of people, the breakup fee has to be paid by the target. My apologies, I think I confused it with something else. Now, in this case, what could Vornado have done differently? Can you outline the strategy?
Well, they could have adjusted the ratio between the stock and the cash payment. So probably pay more stock or pay more cash.
Okay, so that's one answer. They could have paid more. You say they should pay more cash or pay more stock. Sorry, Felix, did you say they should increase cash or increase stock?
Where they could increase, for example, cash and be more similar to the offer from Blackstone.
I would go for cash as well. I would say they should increase cash.
I will write that down, but I see your point. But having said that, one of the reasons why, as we discussed earlier, typically companies, okay, it's several slides before, one of the reasons why companies actually don't go for increasing cash or go for these mixed offers is because in bidding wars, they do not necessarily have the capability to raise cash and raise cash immediately. So it also depends, this answer depends extensively on the leverage ratio of the company and their capacity to have access to cash at very short notice. So it depends essentially on the balance sheet. And that kind of links to why we should be looking at balance sheets when they think about the cash, when they think about these sort of payment structures as well. But having said that, if they can increase their cash, then I agree with you. Then they should definitely go and increase their cash because then they're increasing the certainty from their end. Any other answer? What could have Vornado done differently?
They either could propose an even higher price and maintain the same way of payment.
So
Yes.
So your point being that there is some sort of break-even point where the company, EOP, is willing to take up Vornado's offer, but with the same payment structure.
Yes. So either by changing the payment structure or by changing the offer value.
And they could use breakup fees as well.
But breakup fees are a minus, no, in the negotiation. So if they want to increase their chance to acquire, and they be on top of that they are putting breakup fees, they will reduce the probability of doing the deal. No.
But the thing is that if EOP accepted the breakup fee first for Vornado, basically after that Blackstone in the next offer will have to pay the fee to Vornado. So it can be, I think it can be a strategy.
So I agree with the previous point. Unfortunately, I couldn't see exactly who was talking, but the reason why I would say here breakup fees would not work for Vornado is because of the fact that Blackstone is paying in cash. So for them, they are kind of providing more certainty and then basically charging the company for backing out. On the other hand, Vornado is paying, if it's paying with the same structure, then what it is doing is that it's kind of giving a very bad deal where there's already uncertainty because this is not sure. The shareholders have to yet agree. And then it is still putting more risk on EOP. So as a result of that, I would be a bit hesitant to say that it would be the breakup fees would work for Vornado. I would say where it would work is the following. If they, for instance, increase the certainty of the deal and they use the breakup fees, then they could potentially make Blackstone come up with a stronger offer, because in that case, Blackstone would have to provide probably a higher deal in a more certain deal. Also, one more thing before anyone else wants to jump in, Blackstone is kind of offering a much lower deal than Vornado. And this is because this is sort of the price of uncertainty. So if you, in economics, if you remember, it's like certainty equivalent value of risk. So this is kind of like that. You would rather take a lower payment, which is more certain, than take a higher payment, which is more certain, less certain. And so in that sense, I would say a combination of this would work. But personally, if I were to go with this, I would definitely go with cash and lower stock, so that it could increase the certainty of its deal. Also, potentially the deal might go through with the shareholders better. And it, of course, depends on how it's positioned to actually raise cash during the bidding wars.
Professor, I have a doubt. Is it possible to make agreements on, like, to make less volatile the price of the stock or not? Imagine.
So
an insurance, kind of insurance agreement on the price of the stock.
So that is precisely actually what we are going to get to in a couple of slides. It's you cannot, so sort of maintaining stock price is a very tricky business, mainly because, first of all, it's also illegal in many places, manipulating your own company's stock price. But what you can maintain is the amount that is being paid via stock to the target. So in that sense, you can issue more shares as an example. But we will get to that in just a little bit, because stock is a very cheap version of payment, but at the same time, it's a very uncertain version of payment. So as a result of that, you end up with this more option side style of deals.
Professor, a question.
Yeah.
Sorry. In the second question there, we talked about how Blackstone's price decreased, but at least I didn't hear. Sorry if you approached that, but did we talk about why Vornado's stock price increased?
So one reason why Vornado's stock price could increase is because it's actually benefiting from not winning the bidding war. So it depends. As an example, think about Vornado's stock price like on this dimension, at least on the previous page dimension. So the bidding war starts. Essentially, the stock price should not be changing. But once it starts making bids, if the probability is high, then effectively a stock price might start going down. Now, when it loses, its stock price might shoot up. So essentially, it's just kind of canceling out, because essentially the underlying structure of unless there's some new information which has been revealed about this company, the underlying structure, underlying value of this company has not changed, right? Because it's still the same company. It has not engaged in any new acquisition. It has failed. But if, for instance, the stock price has gone down previously, then losing is getting it the better stock price. On the other hand, because of the fact that Blackstone has won and that has now been set into stone, Blackstone's price decreases because it has ended up with the winner's curse. So it has overpaid for an acquisition which it should not overpay for.
Could we say as well that making bids, in Vornado's case, making a bid or trying to acquire, or this strategy of expansion, let's say, could it be like a signal to investors that their business is prospering, let's say, by making higher bids and trying to acquire a company, and that's why the stock price increases?
That would require some form of new signal. So there is a very good chance that during the mergers process, something might come out. In general, there might be something new which comes out, but that would require some new information, because what we do know from weak form of efficient market hypothesis is that all past information or all publicly available information is incorporated into stock prices. And we do have a lot of evidence for that. So if there's some new information which has been revealed in the whole process, then definitely that what you're saying might be true. But it depends fundamentally what underlying new information has been revealed about this company.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so let's move on because I guess we have half an hour, 25 minutes actually. And thank you all for that discussion and also for helping me with the breakup fee. I should get less confused in general, it seems. So in stock financed mergers, typically the most common approach is to exchange the target shareholders with acquirer stocks. This is referred to as a stock for stock swap. So essentially, if Tesla is taking over GE, then in that case, Tesla offers GE certain ratio that for one GE stock, it will offer maybe like 0.5 of Tesla stocks. So that is the payment ratio. Now in cash, that is very easy because in cash, you could just say, well, I'm going to offer you, I don't know, $45 per share. Whereas in this case, you have to come up with a complicated ratio. And this ratio is referred to, this ratio is referred to as the exchange ratio. So here, this is a bit of a non-statement, the acquirer's ownership base becomes diluted, but this ratio of the stock of the acquirer to the stock of the target is referred to as the ratio of exchange by which you will be actually making the trade. Now, why does this ratio matter? Quite simply because we have a bit of evidence that just in this particular class, where Instagram, as an example, had a particular exchange ratio, and then when the prices went down, then the exchange ratio, then they did not get paid enough. So because this ratio drives the payment, the ratio matters. So this is particularly the Instagram case. Won't spend too much time on it. But what it says is that floating share exchange ratio between Instagram and Facebook was not agreed to, or stock collar was not agreed to, which are two fairly common merger tools, which is why Instagram ended up losing almost $300 million. Now, what both of these are is something we'll cover in the next 20 minutes or so. So here we have a case of United and Continental. I initially intended for you to read it, but nonetheless, let me just explain it to you. What is happening is that the deal between United and Continental, both of which happen to be American airlines, fell apart because they could not agree to an exchange ratio. So there was a disagreement on the exchange ratio. They had agreed to all the other aspects of the deal, but because the exchange ratio drives payments and they did not agree on that, the deal was falling apart. So I will cover this a bit later, but what is happening in this particular case is that the Continental wanted the average of this stock ratio, that is before the announcement date, which is higher than the United stock ratio, which United is willing to offer, which is around here. So in other words, the exchange ratio between the two are quite different. Now, the reason why this matters is because the gap between these two dimensions in terms of payments is quite large. So actually, let me just quickly open up the article and check the precise amounts. Okay, so what the article says here is that the United share price had risen. And as a result of that, the exchange ratio of Continental Airlines to United had decreased, which is what we see over here. Now, the main question over here is what should be the exchange ratio which is being offered by United to Continental? So in this case, the exchange ratio is Continental's share price divided by United's share price. Oh, sorry, the Continental's, this also works. Continental share price divided by United share price. And we have to calculate exactly what the correct value is. So whether it is this over here, or whether it is the value of that United wants to pay. So United wants to give far fewer shares than Continental basically wants to receive. And I realize I've rushed through this a bit, so let me actually point out. In this case, this is a merger where United is trying to take over Continental with a payment in stock. So let me just open the thing on the other. Okay. So to recap, United is the acquirer. Continental is the target. And the exchange ratio is Continental to United, how much ever they are going to pay. Now, there are two methods of finding out what this exchange ratio should be. So first of all, what is the premium that United is willing to pay Continental? Anyone? Well, this particular table is more than kind of enough to explain that. So United is the acquirer, Continental is the target, payment is going through stock. So via stock swap, where a certain amount of stocks of United will be exchanged for stocks of Continental, which leads us to this exchange ratio. So what would be the synergies, or what would be the premium that would be paid here?
So the difference between that Continental share price divided by United price and the actual ratio that is in the proposal. I don't know.
That is very much right. So now the precise amount of premium that Continental and United will share between themselves will basically be some fraction of this. And that fraction actually will be determined by the exchange ratio, because the exchange ratio is kind of saying how much the difference between initial stock price, that is the pre-announcement stock price, and the post-announcement stock price is going to be split between the different parties. So this particular difference, which is between this and this, is roughly, let me check. Okay, it's $554 million. And that we can call it the value of synergy. It can also come from control rights, but at the moment, let's just call it synergies. Now, the task with United and Continental in terms of negotiations is to figure out how much exactly this is going to go to United, how much is going to go to Continental. Now, let us start off by, say, supposing, this is just a wild guess, that half of the synergies are being paid by United to Continental, and the synergies were 554 million.
How do you calculate that value? The 50.
So I feel I have rushed a bit too much through this, so let me once again go through this. United is going to take over Continental. What happens is that this is pre-announcement and this is post-announcement. Now, what happens in this case is that from 6898 minus 6344 is the excess of market. Basically, market is reacting very positively to the combined market cap of these two companies. Now, where does this difference come from? It can come from control rights as an example, which is something we have not covered so far, but it can also come from, say, synergies. So between the acquirer and target, whatever jump you see in the market price, that is the premium that basically is being generated by this particular transaction. Is it clear? Is the whole setup clear? Because
Thank you.
I realized I jumped through it a bit too much. So let us now assume that this 554 million, which is the difference between total before and total after, or rather the other way around, but you get the idea, is half of it is being paid by United to Continental. Now, what was the market value? Oh yeah, it's here. So now the question arises, how much should be the exchange ratio? Let's start off by saying that F is the fraction of the of the combined ownership that Continental's shareholders should receive. So in other words, F is equal to the number of shares which is received by the Continental's, basically the number of new shares which are issued to pay Continental's shareholders in the stock swap, divided by the existing N plus S. So let me explain this much more clearly. When United takes over Continental, initially it has only S, but it is going to engage in a stock swap where it is going to pay a portion of the new combined firm in exchange for Continental's existing shares. That is this N. So these are the new shares. These are the existing shares. And F is simply the fraction of the new firm which is going to be owned by Continental's shareholders. Is it clear so far, or shall I explain it again? Okay. So I will assume that it's clear. If it's not clear, then I will try and explain it once again in the next class. Now, the value of the target will simply be the value of the fraction, or will be a fraction of the value of the combined firm by definition. Quite simply because the target is being absorbed into the combined firm. right? So let's take this thing. Let's call it the new firm. What does it consist of? Consist of Continental plus United plus synergies. Now, basically, this is F. That is the amount of money which is being paid, or stock rather, which is being paid to, which is being paid to the shareholders of, Continental. So this is the amount which is being paid to the shareholders of Continental. So as a result of that, you could also express this as F, or rather this fraction is, this F is simply VC multiplied by VC is equal to the value of target, or in this case, the value of Continental. Now, the value of the target with basically the synergies is equal to this amount. The value before the acquisition plus the value of the synergies. And that is equal to 3216, if I'm not wrong, multiplied by F is equal to the value of the combined firm, which is equal to 6898. Now, if you do that calculation, that works out to 0.466. So, in other words, the fraction of the combined ownership that C shareholder receive is 0.466 of the total value of the new firm. And that is precisely going to be that is precisely going to take us towards the final exchange ratio. Now, in this case,
Professor, shouldn't the F be 2.14?
Why so?
Or I'm kind of lost, like in the equation that you made.
Sorry. It should be the other way around.
Yeah, 2.14.
So now it will be 0.466 because it goes on the other side. This is
Oh,
VC
yeah.
and this is
Change.
VT.
Okay.
Yeah. If any of you are getting a bit worried by the speed at which this is going, I will repeat this in the next class because I realize that we are running out of time, which is causing this a bit of a mess. But the idea very simply is that the fraction of the new firm, which is owned by the Continental's shareholders, is 46.6%. Okay, now remember this formula, which is that the fraction of the firm can also be expressed in another way, which is the number of total shares in the new, in the new company divided with the numerator as the new shares which are paid to Continental. Yeah, sorry.
Just a short question. Where is the 277 coming from again?
So we have made an assumption that half of the synergies are being paid by Universal to Continental.
Yeah.
This is we will have to make that assumption anyway, because the split of the synergies is not something which just comes on its own. It is something which we have to decide upon. So 0.466 is the fraction of the new company, that is the combined firm, which is owned by the target. Now, another way of thinking about the fraction of the combined firm, which is owned by the target, is new shares divided by new shares plus existing shares. Because there are no other new shares coming in other than the shares which are coming from the payment to the United. And United basically is going to become the part of the new company, so it won't have any of its old shares anymore. So to explain again, we made an assumption that half of synergies are going to Continental, are being paid by United to Continental. F, we defined it as the fraction of the new company that is being owned by Continental shareholders. The value of the new company is basically the value of the target plus value of acquirer plus synergies, that is VC. Half of those synergies are going to the target, half of them are going to the acquirer. So in this case, half of them are going to the acquirer. So in this case, we can say that this is fraction, this F fraction. And another way of expressing this F fraction is in terms of the shares within the company, which is N divided by N plus S. I hope that after my rushing through all of that, this clarifies what has happened so far. Now the existing shares of the company so one more way of expressing this is the following. N is equal to SF minus 1 minus F. Now, the existing, which is just an algebraic rewriting of that, the existing share of the company, our Continental has 139.6. United has 174.9. Okay. That is, the new company. So now what is happening is that N is equal to SF minus 1 minus F is equal to how many new shares were issued in this case? So sorry for not mentioning this earlier. The number of new shares which were issued to Continental in the exchange ratio would be 152.45. Now the existing shares of Continental are 139.6 is equal to the exchange rate multiplied by the new shares. So that gives us the exchange rate of 1.09. So here's what I would actually propose. I do not approve of solving this in such a rush. So what I will do right now, instead of trying to just force through this, is I will recap what we did so far, and I will redo this next class as well, because I'm not very comfortable with solving it in this way. Does that work for you guys?
Yes. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yes. So my apologies for this. I did not anticipate that the case studies were going to take so long, but nonetheless, I think it's not nice to force you guys to do something in a haphazard way where you leave in a bad, with a bad understanding of things. So here's what I would propose. For next time, please read through this particular case study. And there is one more case study which comes later, which is the ArcelorMittal takeover. I would recommend that you read through that as well. So these two. These are just simply articles, news articles. So once you read through them, then that will give you a bit more of clarity in terms of, what we are discussing going forward. And I will redo this entire case study once again, because I think that was a bit of a mess, but nonetheless, let me recap what we did so far. What we did so far was that we covered the different versions in which companies can basically make be taken over. The first one is mergers. Second is stock takeovers, which is taking over the shareholders of the company. And the third version is by taking over the assets of the company, which is asset purchases. You can pay for this using both cash as well as stock, or a combination of these two. There are other versions of payments as well which come through, such as debt. And what we are trying to right now do is to understand when we pay stock, what exactly happens and how we calculate the payment ratio. I will once again redo this entire example just so that it's absolutely crystal clear next time. And I will also upload a video in advance so that it is clear in advance as well. I will upload the annotated slides right now. And going forward, because some of you would like to print out, I'll put up the slides one day in advance. What I would recommend from your end is read through those case studies so that next time we can rush or at least go through that quickly. And also, please enroll yourself as a proper enrolled member rather than as guest member. I will be on call for the next half an hour, as is the office hours. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, thank you for your time. And I will see you the Tuesday after next, because next Tuesday is a holiday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Bye, Professor.
Professor, sorry. Will you, as one of my colleagues said, ask you to publish the slides with your notes? Will you do that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
I will do that. So what I'm going to be doing is I'll erase the method of payment because I want to do that from a fresh scratch. So because that needs to be clearer. I don't think that was covered well this time. But everything before that, I will publish it. And also, as usual, I'll be putting up the recording of the Friday video. So I hope you could see last time the video as well. Yeah?
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. See you.
Professor, I wanted to ask for the enrollment key for the Moodle course. I'm sorry if you already mentioned it, but I didn't catch it.
It is in the chat. So it's Hostile Takeover. So if you go to the chat, it's there.
Okay, thank you so much.
I have left it there. What I will be doing, nonetheless, is completely disabling the guest access, because what is happening so far is that many people said that they could not change from guest to enrolled. So once I disable the guest access, I think all of you should be able to enroll normally.
Okay, great. Thank you.
One question: are we going to have a makeup class for the Tuesday,
Yes.
with the holiday?
Yes. So what is going to happen is that next time you're not going to have a class. The Tuesday after next, you're going to have a class, which is going to be basically covering the material for next time. And then your final class will be 1 week later than the Friday session. So that's how the makeup classes are going to work out. I mean, that's exactly how they have scheduled it. I don't think that's exactly very optimal from your perspective, because it will be closer to the exam. But yeah, that's how the scheduling has been. I'm not very comfortable changing the scheduling at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Professor,
so,
you are staying here for the next half an hour or not?
Yes, I
Okay.
am.
I would like to understand better that final part of the class. Sorry.
No, it's not at all a worry. I understand that was very rushed through, but I will explain it again next time. So to give you an idea what is happening over here, United was going to take over Continental.
Yes.
So the payment was going to occur through a stock payment. Now in stock payment, what happens is one of the ways a stock to stock swap. What that means is that for each share of United, Continental gives it a certain X amount.
Yes.
So think about that X as C divided by U.
So
That
the
is for
price
a
of
given.
Continental divided by the price of United.
Exactly. So the price of Continental divided by price of United. What happened was that after the merger was announced, the price of United went up, but the price of Continental did not go up as much. So what you see here is a decline in that stock ratio because the denominator has gone up, but the numerator hasn't kept up. So as a result of that, what United wants to do is it wants to pay at this ratio, which is quite low. It's below 1. But what Continental wants to do is it wants the ratio before the announcement because that's better for it. It gets more stocks of United for a given share of Continental, right?
Yes.
So now the question is, between these two versions, where exactly is the X? So we have here the market capitalizations. Those are before the announcement. That is, here you see in April, 6th April, and
okay.
you have got after the announcement. And the value of the total, that's the combined firm, before and after the announcement is the difference, is the synergies.
Okay.
I mean, it could also be control premium, but it could be synergies.
I'm understanding now.
Yeah.
I think
so which is why precisely I'm going to explain it again next time. I think we ran out of time and I shouldn't have rushed through this, but yeah.
May I try to guide you through my thinking and you correct me if I'm wrong?
Mm-hmm.
I understand better the things that way. So you have that synergies that are a consequence of the announcements, yes, that are valued in the announcements, and and so the agreement that they went at is that they will divide that synergies, and so with half of the synergies they are trying to reach that value of X that we need to calculate. Is that?
Yes. So any company has to, so let me put it this way. You're right. The way it works is that the exchange ratio has implicit in it the distribution of synergies, because this amount is after taking into account this, right? So if the distribution of synergy changes, say from half-half to 1/4, 3/4, then the exchange ratio changes, either increases or decreases, right? So here what we have done in this particular case is we made an assumption. We made an assumption that basically half of the synergies are going to the acquirer and half of them are going to the target.
But normally the acquirer tends to get more of that synergies, no?
On average, yes. So yeah, on average, the value typically accrues to the acquirer. It is the synergies accrue to the acquirer, but it's not always the case, because if you remember from the last class, there was a distribution. So some companies are very good at extracting those synergies after the announcement is done. So in that sense, you're right. This could very well just be 0, and this could be just, the whole S.
Yes.
But in this case, just to give you an idea of where we can come from where we can get this exchange ratio from, I give you an example where they are kind of splitting it half-half. Because if I did it with S and 0, then it would be not an illustrative example, as you can imagine.
But for example, that's the agreement on the percentage of synergies is previous to the announcement or not?
So there is no explicit agreement between the acquirer and the target about the synergies, because they never sit down and say, you get half the synergies, I get half the synergies. But it is all implicit because of the fact that, that they incorporate all these synergies into the valuation, and by basically setting the price, they are kind of saying that the synergies are being distributed that way.
But if the companies goes down after the announcement, that is less probable, but might happen. If the company goes down, who that half of that risk taken is considered, or for example, the buyer pays more that cost?
The risk, if basically everything goes bad, then in that case, both of them actually share the risk as per the exchange ratio, as per their ownership of the company, because this payment is done via stock.
Okay.
So think about it this way. Suppose there was no exchange ratio here. This was all a payment done purely via cash. In that case, all the risk comes to the acquirer, not to the target. In that case, what happens is that the acquirer ends up with basically just a very small, basically none of the risk, all of the risk. So all the negative valuation is going to come to them. But in this case, both the acquirer and the target have a certain amount of risk because they are both owners of the final company. And because of that, proportional to their ownership of the final company, they are actually ending up losing value if everything goes bad. Yeah. Think either my internet is bad or I lost you somehow.
Yes, sorry. I don't know what happened.
Okay, but did you get the idea? Basically, proportional to this F, the acquirer basically ends up losing. The target, ends up losing. So in this case, Continental. Now, the acquirer basically will end up losing 1 minus F because that's their fraction of the ownership.
Yes. Thank you.
No worries. But I will be doing this once again next time, so no worries about that, because I think it's better to do it a bit more slow-paced. One lesson we have learned is case studies take way more time than I anticipated.
Yeah. Can you put a little bit more to the beginning? I would like to see. Don't remember if I had a doubt. Sorry.
Which portion?
Let me see. It's kind of, yeah. I think I get it. It's okay.
Are you sure, or did I just scroll past?
I simply don't remember what was my doubt.
So
this of the hostile takeovers, how this works is kind of the ways you can make pressure for a company to make the decision you want. It's kind of that, no?
Here you mean the bear hug proxy contest and all that. Was that something you were curious about?
Yeah, this is interesting. How this really affects the the company's decision. It's kind of, yes, I would like to see this in practice to better understand it, because
Well,
I think it's too theoretical in a certain way.
To give you I can add a bit of readings on that if you would prefer.
Yes.
So in practice, the way it would work is that basically, as an example, Tesla would be changing out of, say, 12 board members, maybe around 4 or 5, and then they would kind of, pressure these 4 or 5 members to vote as they want to kind of take control in this case. So that would be the way it would work. I can provide you the example of the Carl Icahn, who did the exact same thing to Blockbuster, where he took over the company by changing the board management composition.
That would be very interesting. You have an article on that or something I can read? Or...
Yes, I very much do, and I'm actually going to put that up on the reading anyway, but if you prefer, I can just put that up here. It's a bit biased because it is written from the perspective of the guy who got kicked out. I forgot his name.
Okay.
So obviously he is going to be a bit of complaining about this, but you still get an idea about how the whole thing went down.
Okay. So I wait if you post on Moodle.
So I have posted it here as well in case you want to read it up, and I'll be posting it up on Moodle as well.
I'm not seeing where the message.
It should be in the chat.